ever feel like your orchids are all over the place? When I first started growing, my orchids were all over. They would fall off the windows. I would knock them down. They were in the wrong pots. And I kind of struggled with growing my collection. Over time, I ended up getting shelves, and I learned little by little how to keep everything organized. And I find that with an organized collection, I have more peace of mind. I'm able to grow my orchids more effectively because I group them in a specific way. And overall, when you keep an organized collection, it's a lot nicer to look at. So today's video is going to be all about organization. I'm going to share what I've learned in the last few years growing a massive collection like this, some things that I'm working on, ways to make it look nicer, ways to be more practical about your growing, and just little things here and there that I picked up along the way. If you guys like this kind of video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more orchid content. Let's jump right in. Okay, let's start with the practical stuff. You have to determine the kind of space that you're going to utilize. With me, I have over 200 orchids and plants, so I opted for vertical shelves. If you're growing on windowsills, you need to organize them on the different sills, but you'll have less space. So that's why I opted for something with vertical space. This is the best way to maximize the space that you have. I know some growers organize things on tables. I know some others hang their orchids, and some growers, especially those in really good climates, they can grow their orchids outside year round. In my case specifically, I opted for shelves because it was more bang for my buck. I can grow more orchids vertically and keep them nice and neat. Now, one of the most important things in growing on shelves is lighting requirements. So what I like to do is I group some of my orchids based on their light requirements. So I have some strong lights. I have very strong lights for my cattleyas over here. And I have some less intense lights in my first shelf over here. So let me show you what that looks like. So I have a lot of Phalaenopsis here. They don't need too much light. You'll see I have a Brassavola here, and that's because it was blooming and I wanted to show it off and have it more at eye level. But it's very important to make sure that you divide the light so that orchids with similar light requirements are together, and that helps them thrive. Now, if you put your orchids anywhere, they may not thrive. So I have higher intensity lights and lower intensity lights. On my lower intensity light shelf, I only have 2 strips of light. On my higher intensity light shelves, I either have stronger lights or additional lights. So I have 3 or 4 strips of lights with my cattleyas, for example. So I try to put my higher light requirement orchids there, and it helps out a ton in their growing. So separating your orchids into their different light requirements is going to be important. So having a space for high light, low light, moderate light can be very helpful in getting your orchids to grow. Along those lines, I also group my plants by their care requirements. So I have a lot of my Oncidiums here together. I have a lot of my Phalaenopsis together. Those are pretty much in moss. And I group them together because they have similar care requirements. So when I'm watering, oftentimes I'm watering those more often. So that's super helpful in making sure that you're caring for them properly. I find that it's helpful to group your Phalaenopsis and your Paphiopedilums. Oncidiums, I group them together as well. I keep my Vandas together as well. So whenever I'm watering, I'm not watering everything all at once. I'm watering whatever needs it. And if they're close together, it's more efficient for me, and I could go in and out of the grow space a lot easier. Okay, we got the main practical stuff out of the way, the light and the care requirements together. One thing I'd add to that is if you have any orchids that are resting, make sure to separate those as well, because you don't want to be fertilizing them by mistake. With that out of the way, let's talk about more aesthetics. So you got to think about your pots, in my opinion. So when I first started growing, I would get my orchids, I got seedlings, and I got so many different things in these nursery pots that were square or round in bark. And it didn't really work well for my environment. I would put them on my shelves and they would fall and nothing looked consistent. It didn't look nice. It didn't look pretty. So over time, I just started experimenting with different kinds of pots. Now, it takes a lot of time to figure out what you like. In the beginning, I bought all repot me pots, and it took me about a year and a half to get through it. Let me actually show you one. So here's one of my orchids in a repot me pot. I have it in a cash pot. Let me get it out for you. But check this out. I hate these pots so much. They just grow through. They're not great. So I moved away from that. So when you are growing, so when you're starting to grow, it's important to experiment with different things and see what works for you. It was very frustrating for me in the beginning, but just something as simple as choosing the right pots is so important. I would get the repot me pots, and then I would buy a more expensive decorative pot that I'd put it in. So these pots were more expensive. They're heavier, so they didn't topple over. But as you're organizing and growing your collection, having some consistency in the kind of pots that you use can be very helpful. I personally like a heavier pot because that means your orchid's not gonna fall down as easily. But I ended up moving towards more plastic pots. And once I found something that I liked, it took me maybe like 2.5 years to start using it consistently in the collection. And I'm very happy with it. But when you use those nursery pots, you have to have some sort of system. Put it into maybe like a small clay pot, something like that, so that it doesn't fall over. But that's super important. Something I also really think is very helpful is using like a mat over the shelves, because the shelves have grooves. So if you put something down, it could topple over. If you're watering, water could spill on your floor. So I use a mat over every shelf, a shelf liner. I've linked the ones that I've got down below. I got them on Amazon. There's a bunch of different kinds, but that sort of thing can help keep your collection nice and organized by way of things not falling, things not shifting around, water not falling on your floors, and I find it super, super helpful. I think if you get a theme of different kinds of pots that go together, it makes it look so much nicer. So if you just take whatever pot you can get from the orchid nursery, you could definitely do that. But if you want a collection to look nice and tidy and neat, I recommend seeing what you like the most. Maybe it's clay pots, maybe it's very bright pots, maybe you want rainbow colored pots, something that that you like, something that you enjoy looking at. If you're good with the nursery pots, that's totally fine. But if you want something more aesthetic, going with like a theme of similar colored pots is fantastic. I try to group some of my pots together. Like I have a lot of white pots. That's very bland for some people. Some people like very bright pots or different kinds of pots. Find what works for you and what you like, and just double down on it and just keep some sort of consistency in your collection. If you like multicolor, buy a bunch of different color pots and they're all over. Like I say it's helpful to have a theme, and it makes things look so much more interesting. Like I said, decorative cache for me are helpful because I water right on the shelves, so I can't take everything out and bring it to my sink every single time I water. So that's important for me. It may not be as important for you. Some people are able to take all of their plants and bring them to the sink to water. But I think just knowing what works best for you in your environment, what you like to see, the kind of aesthetic that you want to have, that all helps. And it makes it more pleasurable to grow too. Like if everything looks kind of tidy, you're gonna want to be around it. If it looks messy, it's gonna be overwhelming, at least for me. Something that's also helpful is to rotate your blooming orchids. And sometimes I'm guilty of leaving an orchid all the way in the back or something like that, but you want to get your orchids out and you want to showcase them when they're blooming. So why hide your orchid on a bottom shelf if it's showing its blooms, you know? So I think it's super important to try to get your orchids that are blooming out in a more prominent spot towards the front of the shelf, so you could walk in and see them. You could walk in and smell them. If they're on a bottom shelf and you can't quite get into it and see it or like even smell it, it's the whole point of growing is for flowers. So We want to show those flowers. So rotate all of your orchids that are blooming, put them in the front, get them out of those bottom shelves and move them up a little bit. And you could showcase them, you can smell them. When people see your collection, they're able to see the hard work that you put in. I mean, that's the whole goal of growing. You're blooming your flowering plants, right? So you want to show them off. Okay. One last thing for aesthetics that I really like, and I'm starting to experiment with more, and I'm going to do this a lot more, is I've been adding plants with foliage around the grow space to add more interest. So orchids, when they're not in bloom, you're not really seeing much. They're not really known for their foliage, and that's absolutely fine. But I've been getting more into Hoyas. I've been getting more into other kinds of houseplants. And I find that the ones with very nice foliage add a lot of interest. So especially the ones that hang down. So I have some ideas to put some nice foliage plants on trellises so that they can climb up on the corners. That's something I'm going to be working on as we head into spring, but maybe some pothos on a trellis. And as they climb up, the leaves get bigger. I have that in mind for a corner here. So I'm going to put it on a nice big trellis so it could look nice and add a little bit more interest, especially when things are not blooming. My Hoyas, they vine, so I'm starting to put them in the corner so they can hang down and add a little bit more interest. They flower as well. You could see them more prominently. So I have many in trellises, but I'm going to be hanging some of them so they could go down these poles here. So that'll be interesting. It just adds a little bit more interest when things are not blooming. You have something nice to look at, you know? There's so many things you could do with your collection. At the end of the day, you want to be happy with what you're looking at. If you find that your collection is a little bit messy and all over the place, I think consistent pots are helpful. Something that's a little bit heavy so things don't topple over. You could hang things as well on the corners. I think adding some foliage adds a lot of interest. You absolutely don't have to do that. I just like ideas to keep things looking very interesting and fresh, especially when things are not in bloom. But at the end of the day, I think you just got to go with whatever works for you. So white pots are not for everyone. Very bland for some people. Some of my friends, they don't like white walls, white pots. That's not for them. So something bright, clay pots, group them. It makes it look so much nicer. You could even add risers to some of the orchids in the back and add some height. I'm not there yet, but imagine. I just have too many, so if I had less, I would definitely organize them a little bit more. But as I'm repotting everything into a more consistent setup, I'll constantly be working on this collection, adding some trailing plants, adding a plant that's going to be on a trellis that's going to climb up to the ceiling. These are all ideas that I think make it really nice to grow your collection. You're around something beautiful. If you don't have something in bloom, it's no problem. You have other things to look at. Even when you're watering, it's like you're in a little jungle. So those are some of my ideas on how to keep your collection organized. Let me know down below if you do anything in your collection as well. Keeping everything nice and pretty brings the hobby to another level where you just want to be around it all the time. Put your thoughts down below on other things that you do for your collection to keep it organized, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, everyone.